first?
Hello, testing.
All right. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Community Church of Sebastopol. Welcome to this conversation with Alan Murakami. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I just saw the green light go on, so I know we're now live streaming, and also this recording will be available afterwards if anybody missed it. So if you enjoy what you hear today and want to recommend that, it'll be on the church's YouTube channel. So it is, actually let me begin this way. We mentioned in our worship service this morning, but I'll mention it again, that today is the day of remembrance for the bombing of Hiroshima. And we have a beautiful banner here that was created by one of our members, Kathy Mathis. And on it are 1,000 paper cranes. In the tradition of the legend of Sadako, there are 10 strands of 100 cranes there, cranes for peace. And the Japanese words that are listed there are the words for peace and also for forgiveness. So I wonder if we could just hold a minute of silence and remembrance before we begin our program. May peace prevail upon all the earth. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that as we begin, that our sanctuary where we're holding this event is on the traditional and unceded land of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok peoples, who have been stewarding this land for generations. And so we begin with that word of respect. My name is Reverend Benjamin Broadbent. I'm the lead minister here at the Community Church of Sebastopol. It's my joy and honor to sit up here with Alan Murakami. Of course, Alan, I know you primarily as Margaret's son.
Yes.
I've spent a lot more time with your mom than I have with you. But just being Margaret's son, raises your esteem, I think, in anyone's eyes. That's a pretty special connection. And we're here to talk about Alan's book that was published just in the last few months or so, right?
Yeah.
And the book is called Peter Masuoka. Am I saying his name correctly?
Yes.
Peter Masuoka. I know there's some other pronunciations that you list in here. The Uncle I Never Knew. Alan is a member of Community Church of Sebastopol. He is a retired school psychologist. In fact, there are some people in the room who have worked with him in that capacity. And he told me he was looking out and saw a lot of familiar faces. So I know that Alan has some personal connections with many of you. But I would just like to begin, actually let me say this, there will be an opportunity after the talk if you'd like to purchase your own copy of Alan's book. Those are available here, and you'll have that opportunity, and maybe even an inscription on that from the author himself. So you can think about whether you'd like to do that at the end of our time. I also think that we'll be here we'll shoot for about an hour, but we don't have a hard ending time, depending on how the conversation is going. So Alan, I'll just maybe start with this question, and then you can spend some time just introducing yourself and then responding to that question. But I'm curious, just as a way into it, is what inspired you to write this particular what inspired you to write this particular book? When did that arise, and what inspired you?
Well, first, I'd just like to thank you and Joyce Cox for initiating the invitation for me to come today. It's very nice to be back in the sanctuary. What inspired me? In fact, it was the shelter in place. I said, gee, I'm going to be home. Might as well do something. So I started to think about writing about my uncle. He was killed in the war, and I said, no one really knows him. No one, he has no family. And so I brought out an old shoebox that I had a bunch of notes. When I went to family gatherings, I would write down when people were talking about Pete. And so I pulled those out, and I just put pencil to paper and just started to write about him. And it's been quite a journey doing that. Some of the difficult parts were there wasn't a lot of information about Pete. I knew he was born in Sonoma. He went to the local schools, Sebastopol Elementary, Anley, and the JC. And then he was in the war, and that was all we really had. Unfortunately, he had written letters to his parents when he was in basic and when he was overseas. But unfortunately, and understandably, during a time of deep grief, my grandfather, Pete's dad, burned all of his letters and his medals, his uniform in a bout of grief. So we didn't have a lot of personal information about him.
It strikes me that you took that experience of the lockdowns and the shelter in place, and instead of doing nothing or wishing you could do more, you did something with that time. And I think maybe many of us had an experience of taking on some new practice or rhythm in life during that time, and we're grateful that your rhythm and practice led to the story that you have to tell here. I also understand, wasn't there a family friend who said to you, you've got to write this down, you've got to tell the story before it gets lost?
Yes. One individual, he kept encouraging me to do this, George Thau, and one day at the Japanese-American luncheon, he was very emphatic. He says, Alan, start. Do this now before people that have any information about Peter, well, they're still here. So I have deep appreciation to George for that.
That's great advice, to start, because you can't finish something unless you've started it, right?
So true, so true.
Tell us a little bit more about Pete's formative years. I'm particularly interested, I like how you describe the kind of person he was at Annalee High School.
Yes, Pete was, I think, a very quiet individual, kind of an introvert. He excelled academically and also in sports. And there were some really profound experiences while I was writing. One of them was this individual family friend came up to me and says, I think you would like this. I said, well, what is it? And she pulled out this very heavy plaque. And what it was back, I think, in those days, in the 30s, at the elementary school, at Sebastopol Elementary, they would put on this heavy plaque the names of the basketball players. And on it was Pete's name. And I didn't know he played basketball in elementary school. So at Anley, he was class president. He was also very well known on the football field, played baseball. Oh, and a side note was interesting is that he was left-handed. But at elementary school at the time, everyone wrote right-handed. So my mom goes, well, that's why his handwriting is so illegible.
So he was a southpaw.
He was a southpaw. Yeah, yeah. So I have just a couple of letters, and yeah, his handwriting wasn't that great.
So he was forced to write right-handed, but when it came to the ball field, whether basketball or football or baseball, he was throwing left.
He was throwing
Yeah.
left. Yes, yes. And he was also the first Japanese American that was awarded the American Legion Citizenry Award. And that was quite an honor at that time.
And that was while he was in high school still, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, at Anley.
Okay. And he went on to the junior college. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And he even played rugby there as well as some other sports.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, that was a new sport to him. And he also did track, I think. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Can you talk to us? Part of your book is, retelling the story in the context of telling the story about your uncle. Is telling again the story of the experience of local Japanese Americans following December 7th, 1941. Can you talk a little bit about that, the experience of local Japanese Americans kind of after the attack on Pearl Harbor and leading into eventually being put on trains to various... I thought it was interesting that you said, let's just call it a concentration camp, because that's what it is. And you make a distinction. It's not the same kind of concentration camp that was in Germany at the time, but for all intents and purposes, it was a concentration camp.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of getting ahead, moving from just kind of the experience of local Japanese Americans leading up to that. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese American community was sensing and feeling the growing hatred, if I could use that strong of a word, racism. And I'd like to also just add that there were many places up along the Pacific coast where Japanese Americans were treated very, very poorly. But I'd like to say in Sonoma County that was different. There was an empathy, a sensitivity, a support in Sonoma County. There were even people that watched over the Japanese Americans' property when they were in camp. Some actually even paid their property tax, because if they didn't, when the war was over and the Japanese Americans came back, they didn't pay their property tax, they lost their homes. So it was a blessing to be in Sonoma County and to feel that type of support. In fact, I don't know how many people remember, know, I apologize, Barbara Bertoli? Several, yes. Well, Mom and Barbara, as you know, are very close friends. And Barbara's mom actually took sandwiches to the train station when the Japanese Americans were getting on the train. So these acts of kindness that were very profound.
I appreciate it in your book. I mean, you kind of bring up that at the time there was a kind of justification, like, well, it's war, and war calls for desperate measures. But you make a point to say, yeah, and it was racism, and it was hatred, and war does not justify that. And so, you weave, your story is a woven story between that and these small and not so small acts of kindnesses that get shared.
Right.
And I appreciated that weaving. You didn't want to let anybody off the hook, but you also didn't want, you wanted credit to go where it was due. That is the small acts of kindness.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I'll always remember that one significant act of kindness by, Jack Gerbeth and Sarah Gerbeth Johnson.
Tell that story. Not a lot of people in the room know that story, but not everybody knows it.
Oh, okay. Well, Mrs. Gerbeth, I'm sorry, I have to refer to Mrs. Gerbeth. She was my Sunday school teacher, so Um, she, she and Jack, after the war, heard, I mean, these were folks that were in their teens, and they were part of the community church, and they heard about an act of vandalism at the Buddhist church in Sebastopol.
Enmanji Temple,
The Enmanji Temple,
which is
yes.
an historic building.
It is
A
historic.
beautiful building, yes.
Yes. So these teenagers took it upon themselves to organize a vigil, to go out and to protect from further vandalism. And I think I could be wrong, but I think what they did was they told their parents, well, we're just going to go out with some friends. And they also, I think that their parents said, well, you can only be together on certain things, like dates were kind of like, well, we've got to check that out. So they went and stood vigil along with others. And I heard that story for years, but then it dawned on me when I was writing the book that what an act of bravery. I mean, here were teenagers not knowing if, you know, the vandals would come back with guns or with other acts of violence. But what an act of courage they did to stand up for what was right.
In Enmanji Temple, if you haven't had an opportunity, first of all, it's a beautiful space. It's very sacred. But inside, you'll see some of the fire damage that was there from a fire that was set. They've left it there as a testament to what had happened. But there's also a plaque inside the room mentioning the young people from this congregation who stood vigil to make sure that no further vandalism happened. And when we were given a tour there, our confirmation class was given a tour there, the people at Enmanji Temple speak in a very honoring kind of way of those teenagers and also of their relationship to community church. So
Right.
That's an important bond.
Yes, so
Yeah.
true, so true.
So Pete, along with brothers and his sister and his parents, as well as neighbors and other family, they boarded trains in Santa Rosa with sandwiches and what they could carry in what were at the time very small suitcases. Not the big old suitcases we have now, but
Right.
very few belongings.
Mm-hmm.
And initially they were in the valley, right?
Merced.
Merced.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there they went to the Amache
Mm-hmm.
camp
Mm-hmm. Colorado.
in southeast Colorado.
Right. Yeah.
And that was the place, you have that part in your book where you say, again, certain people were trying to justify this. It's for your own safety. And one of the prisoners at the camp said, well, then why are the machine guns pointed inward?
Yes. Yes.
But the people who were there, they made, the best of the situation that they could.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't much privacy. It was really cold.
Mm-hmm.
And Pete was there. And Pete, in the midst of that, enlisted for the Army,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is a decision I can't totally comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could help me and others. Like, what do you understand about Pete's decision to enlist in the army of the country that has just placed him and his family members against their will as prisoners in a concentration camp?
Yes, that was that was I think a most difficult conflict within each individual in the camps. There were some that said, this government put me here. There's no way I'm going to volunteer. And there were many also, like Pete, that said, well, what better way to show our allegiance to America than to fight for our country? Pete's older brothers were already in the service, Hank and Butch. And so he enlisted, he joined, and he was in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was a segregated unit. And I think that I asked my mom, because I said when I was writing this, oh, was there any hesitation? And she kind of said very emphatically, no, there was none. You know, it was, this is what you do. And so that was a family value too at the time of, you know, supporting the country.
In your book, as I read it, I thought about that quote that I forget who said it. It was like the longest distance is the distance from your head to your heart. And the way I hear that is, you know, I'm reading it and I'm thinking, oh, this is a very interesting story, and I'm taking in the data that you're sharing. And that was the first moment in your book where it dipped down. I just was so struck that of his bravery and commitment and loyalty to a country that had not treated him or his family in any way fairly, but that it was so important to prove his loyalty, and not just his loyalty, but his community's loyalty to their country.
That's so true. And I think most, well, not most, but I think that there's a tendency for veterans when they come back from a war that many don't talk about it because of the trauma. And so my uncles, they never really talked about the war too much. My dad also, he was an MP, but he didn't talk about it. And so they didn't talk about some of the conflicts, the emotional conflicts, the psychological conflicts, because one of them was, okay, I'm going to enlist in the army. What happens if Japan wins? What will happen to me? I think these were thoughts in many of the soldiers. Or if the U.S. wins, will we still be in camp? You know, there's all these questions I'm sure they had, but I don't know, they never talked about them.
Wow. I had never considered that thought before, the unknown of it, and yet still this is the right thing to do.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you, I was wondering if you could talk about the photo that's on, there's a,
Yeah, I know.
there are a couple bugs up here that are giving me and Alan a lot of attention. There's a photo on page 89, which it sounds like there was quite a moment when you discovered this picture, this photo, and the meaning of it. Yeah, he's like, which one am I talking about? That one.
Oh, yes.
Can you just describe that photo, talk about what it meant to find it because of you realized the meaning of it?
Yes. It's a photo of Pete and two others. They're posed near a Jeep. And
In France, right, at the time?
in France, right. And it was, again, backtracking, there was all these profound moments writing this book, and one of them was I was helping mom declutter a closet, and I pulled out, and I brought it here. It's a scrapbook. I said, Mom, what is this? And she goes, oh, that's Pete's. What? What? And she said, oh, yeah, what happened was he started the scrapbook when he was going to Anley, and he kept it with him during basic, took it over to Italy and France. And I said, well, that's amazing, just because we have very few possessions of his. So in one of the back pages is this photograph of Pete and these two Army individuals. And when I looked on the back, it has the date November the 7th, 44, excuse me. And it was the date he was killed. And so it was, I said, Mom, you know, this picture has so much feeling behind it. Because in the picture, Pete looks a little aloof. He's standing off a little bit to the side. And in the picture is this other individual, and his name is Les Murakami, no relation. And the unfortunate story is on that day, Pete and his squad were out rescuing wounded soldiers, and he came back. He was tired, but his commanding officer said, "We need another group to go out. There's more soldiers." And so Les Murakami was next up to go out, and he said, "I don't feel well, so I'm not going to go." So Pete volunteered to go. So he was out there rescuing the wounded, and a shell, he could hear a shell. And he said to his buddies, "Dive to the left," and he dove to the right, and he was killed. So, and that was Pete. He always volunteered for things. That was who he was. So his buddies, they brought his body back, to the army camp, and he was at first interned in Epinal, France. That was a temporary cemetery. And after about a year, the army asked his mom, do you want his body brought back to the States? And she said yes. So Pete's buddies did escort the casket, and they also brought back that scrapbook, and they handed it to my mom.
I just want to honor the tenderness with which you tell that story. So much respect.
Thank you.
And I think for me, another head-to-heart moment was you make the point in your book that volunteering was the kind of person that Pete was, and that was also a value of his community, of the Sebastopol community, of the Japanese-American community. Something needs to get done. Someone needs to volunteer to do that, and he embodied that. Would you also tell us, you begin the book with your own experience of going to where Pete's remains were interred, and your own experience on Memorial Day of visiting that place. Can you just say a little bit about your memories as a young boy, is that right? And going and visiting the National Cemetery?
Yes. Pete is interned in San Bruno at the Golden Gate National Cemetery. I think it's national. And so a little aside is my grandmother, on every Memorial Day, she would get up at 5 a.m. and say to the family, "Okay, we're going to go." They always bring flowers, and so she's up at 5, and by 5:30 she is seated at the kitchen table waiting for all of her children to get ready. "Come on, let's go." And so, but she's waiting patiently with her purse, and they would drive down, through San Francisco to San Bruno and take flowers to Pete. And so I grew up with that same tradition with my mom and Dad, and the four of us with my sister Leslie. We would go down every Memorial Day and take flowers to Pete, and so it was just something we did, just part of our way to honor Memorial Day and to honor Pete. And sometimes Mom would bring cherries from our family cherry tree and place them by his grave and say, "Hi, Pete, and hope you enjoy these." And as a little aside, about 100 or so feet away from Pete's grave marker, there's one in particular, and it's Admiral Chester Nimitz. And those who know this individual, he was one of the main individuals that was, I think he was the admiral of one of the fleets, and he's right by Pete, so that was quite extraordinary.
It strikes me, that as a little boy, you're going to the cemetery to go honor an uncle that you had never met. And so that act of memory and everything that was involved with it, the getting ready, the driving down there, the getting out of the car, the laying on of flowers, like all those embodied practices of remembering. And it strikes me that in writing this book, it's an outgrowth of that early experience that you had of creating a relationship with a member of your family that you had never met. And it strikes me that the title of your book is The Uncle I Never Knew, but then on the last page, I just want to read your last words of the whole book. You've moved from the uncle I never knew to your conclusion, Domo arigato gozaimasu, Uncle Pete. Thank you very much, Uncle Pete. It has been an honor and privilege to know you. And I'm just curious, like, how you understand this act of remembering that was your process of putting together this book, where you moved from the uncle I never knew to actually addressing him and saying, thank you very much, it's been a pleasure to have known you. I mean, you made a journey there, and I'm curious about that, and it's very moving to me.
Thank you. Yes, because when I started writing, I knew maybe a tenth of what I wrote in the book about this individual. I knew just some pieces. And even then, I didn't know them comprehensively. And so by re-interviewing my mom and reading my notes and doing research through all of these very well-written books about the 442nd, I felt like I know Pete now. And by putting on paper, others can get to know him. Not only just the pieces of, like, he went to school here, or he did this, but also that his character, who he was as an individual. I feel like I got to know him at that level. And an aside, it's wonderful when I go see my mom and we have lunch, and she'll drop these little bombs of information about Pete, which will be in the second edition. No, she goes, oh yeah, Pete rode a motorcycle. Oh, really? I didn't know that. I mean, that's another chapter. To me, that opens another line of inquiry of who this individual was. I think, who knows, there might be a second edition. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just struck that in the act of remembering, you're actually increasing your acquaintance with the person. And sometimes in a memorial service here at the church, I will just become aware of, and I'll say out loud, like, this person who we're remembering represents really like a whole universe unto themselves. And what we're able to say in this 1 hour together is just going to be a tiny fraction. So I'm glad to know that there are still, motorcycles and other other details that your mom is literally trickling out to you as they come.
Trickle is a good word.
Good word.
Yes.
So I wonder, I was just kind of wanting to turn to those who are here in the room to ask if you have a question for Alan to respond to. And I'll bring the microphone to you. And I want you to speak into the microphone because the folks that are on the live stream and who will watch this afterwards will want them to be able to hear the question.
It's actually a comment. Your mother came to our youth group, I think it was like in October this past fall, and was telling about her experience. And when she described the family being taken away, what really hit me hard and finally understood the awfulness was when she said, we could only take a few things, not toys, not books. She said, but we had to leave our dog behind. And I thought, it really brought home to me, like, they're just ripped out of their lives and taken away.
Yes, that's true. They're animals, they're pets, and if I could say, they did not know where they were going. And so they had this little suitcase, right? So they didn't know if they were going to go to the desert, if they were going to go into cold areas. So what do you bring? And one of my most appreciated photos is, and it's in the book, is Mom and her parents standing, I guess it's like December, January, in Colorado, and there's this huge snowman. And Mom is in a dress. And I asked Mom about it, and she says, well, yeah, it was a little bit cold. And she said, well, finally, I think this was like January, February of 42. About 10 months after that, she said, oh, finally, we were able to order things through Monkeys. I don't know if you remember Monkeys, Montgomery Wards. So they were finally able to order appropriate weather-inclined clothing.
Other comment or question? Yeah.
So my understanding is Pete was born in Sonoma, correct?
Mm-hmm.
How did his family originally end up in the United States?
My grandfather came from Okayama, Japan in 1906, and he arrived in San Francisco just in time to experience the earthquake. And so they migrated up to Sonoma County, and they were in the fields picking apples and whatnot. And he went back to Japan, and his wife was a picture bride, and they had one son who my mom never met, Takeji, who was born in Japan and stayed there. And then they came back to the United States and had their family.
Another question or comment? Yeah, Eva.
I'm very curious about the years that your Uncle Pete spent at Anley. What years were those?
Let's see. I think there were 1930. What is it, Renee? God, I'm blanking out.
Probably about
36, 39, about that.
Oh, I just packed one of my in-laws' Anley yearbook from 1941, and I was just wondering if his picture would have been in there, but maybe
yeah.
not.
Yeah. And they still have some of the yearbooks at Anley that you can pull out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see a picture of him.
Yeah, so true.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, Norm. Here you go.
Well, a step forward with segregation was San Francisco. I was raised there and lived there until I was about 27. And I remember well the war happening in December the 7th, and sitting in my house and looking out the window, expecting to see Japanese planes coming into San Francisco. That was the question, whether they would continue, because they had a large flotilla out there and with airplanes and all. But nothing ever happened that I ever saw any discrimination. Of course, they were removed for a few years into the camps, but even after they came back, they excelled in schools, and I think that was a good thing, because before the schools came in different districts, there was Japanese town, Chinese town, Italian town, which I lived in for a while, Russian Hill, which were Russian people, and the school system drew from a wide range because of the proximity to the different people and the schools, and had to function in that manner. And the Japanese people did so well, I remember, in the school system there. And I never saw any segregation at all. It was integration, totally. And I know I had friends, because of swimming, that were all over the city, that I swam with and against. And we went to meets together in college and high school. And I have nothing but praise for them, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
This is my lovely wife, Renee, I like to say.
I think she's a plant here with a
She
question.
is.
Yeah.
She is my plant.
Indeed. You'd think I wouldn't have any questions left, right? No, I wondered, I know you had a lot of very profound experiences over the course of writing telling Uncle Pete's story. I know that one important part of this was being able to literally put a book in your mom's hands as a way to honor Uncle Pete, and that, we're so lucky that that was able to happen. But I know you had a lot of profound experiences. I wonder if you might want to share about finding out that Uncle Pete had a fiancée.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Thank you, Renee. Oh, and another aside, if I may. Sure. Today is the exact date that Renee and I got married, right here.
Happy anniversary.
My lovely wife. So
Happy anniversary. Wow.
40 years ago. Yes.
If we'd known, would have had an enormous cake.
Oh, no,
and
no, no.
done all the stuff. Yeah. Champagne and all the rest. Yeah.
Yes, there were some very profound moments writing this book. About a month or so before I went to self-publish, I get this email, and it's from, well, I'll back up. Pete was dating a Holly Onomiya. This was in Anley, and they hung out together at JC. In fact, both families were in camp. And in camp, they both realized for many reasons that, they were going to get married, but maybe we shouldn't. Holly was a very dedicated family person, and she wanted to take care of her parents. And Pete's dad said to Pete, you're going off to war. I don't know if you want to get married, and, you never know what happens. So they broke off the engagement. And about 4 to 5 weeks before I self-publish, I get this email, and I just basically just stop, because it's from Holly's niece, Marcia. And she says, I'd like to meet you. Holly unfortunately passed away March of really recently, and we have some possessions that we'd like to give you. And I brought them today, if you like to look at them. And one of them is a locket. And at that time, you put pictures of your, fiance and yourself, and it is of Holly and Pete. So she kept that, for all these years. She never married. And it was just such a touching part to add to Pete's story.
Yeah, I feel it when you tell that story. I just wanted to, as we're kind of starting to wrap up here, on the last page of your book, the same page that I read from your last line, right above that, you said that you don't think that Pete would have been one who put too much stock in the Japanese phrase shikage go nai, or shoganai, which means something like,
I forgot what I wrote.
it means like can't be helped.
Oh, it can't be helped. Okay.
It's kind of like, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
What happens, happens. It's a bit kind of fatalistic, kind of like, and so I wanted to connect that to his value in volunteerism, right? It's like, as long as you still have breath, things don't just happen. You help make things happen. You step into that space.
Right.
But I just recently, totally separate from your book, became aware of another Japanese phrase, kind of part of kind of ancient Japanese philosophy, like shikage go nai, and that is mono na aware, which means literally means the pathos of things, the deep feeling that is in things, the empathy that we can have for each other, and it just strikes me that your your book, my sense is that you experienced some of that writing the book. As you got to know the uncle you never knew, you experienced that mono na aware, that deep connection with his life, with your family's life, with the Japanese American community's life, what they went through, their ups and downs, joys and sorrows, the racism as well as the little acts of kindness. And I'll say that in reading your book, and I've said this before, like I felt that at moments. It's that ability to like have empathy for the story of another person that you've never met, and maybe you've never even really thought about or imagined before, but once you read their story, it's like we dip down and we connect at this human space, kind of underneath it all. And so I guess just in closing, I wonder whether you had ever heard that phrase before, mono na aware, the empathy of between things or the pathos of things, and if that at all describes the experience you had as you connected with your uncle.
I've heard something related to that, yeah.
And I may not have it exactly right or be describing it exactly the way it's meant to be, but so that's my sense of it.
Well, and it's a very deep idea, right? The empathy between two things, between that stuff. And I feel like that kind of summarizes, I think, part of what I walked away by writing this. I felt connected to Pete at a much deeper level, which was an unexpected result of writing this. My main goal was just to kind of get his story on paper, but I appreciate what you just said, because I think, in a way, I now can feel like I got to know him, but I also feel a connection to him.
Well, I want to thank you, Alan, and I want to thank all of you for being here. To Joyce Cox for kind of arranging this, to Sophia Broadbent-Bell for running our sound and our live stream today, and would like to ask that you join me in thanking Alan Murakami for coming and sharing his story. Thank you. And it sounds like people can come up and look at some of the items that you've brought up here that are displayed on the piano. And over here, if you would like to buy a book